Thank you very much, Pavel. Thank you for the opportunity to come and give this talk. So I wasn't sure today exactly what kind of an audience I would have in terms of zoologists, zooarchaeologists, archaeologists, and so on. So I'm going to try to give this talk for a broad audience, not assuming that you either know the zoology or know the archaeology. Some of you would both. Okay, so this talk relates to a small project that I have going on at the moment, which is the reason why I'm currently in Kiev, which is not focused on Ukrainian material. It's focused, well, it's covering material from all over Europe, but particularly looking at places where there isn't much published data already, and Ukraine is one of those places. And I'll explain all this as I go along. But I just want to be clear at the beginning that this is not going to be a talk focusing on the work I've been doing here in Kiev, although I will mention that at the end. In fact, I'm going to focus quite a bit of my talk on Northern Europe, where I've done the most research so far, and then explain from there why Ukrainian material becomes relevant to Northern Europe. So an outline of the talk, I'll start off with some basic background as to why I'm interested as an archaeologist, and I myself am from an archaeological background. I work in an archaeology department. I just happen to work with animal bones. Okay, so I'm not from a zoological background. So I'll start by talking a little bit about why I'm interested in looking at ancient rat bones. I'll say a little bit about what we know about rats, about the dispersal of black rats around the world from modern genetics, and then I'll move into the archaeological evidence for the earliest finds of black rats around Europe and their subsequent history in Europe. As I said before, I'll then give something of a slightly more detailed case study of the north of Europe, where I know the material the best. And then I have a couple of final points I'd like to make, which aren't really the main thrust of this talk, but which are quite interesting, I think, especially to a broad audience. So one is the connection between rats and plague, and the other one is the other major European rat species, the brown rat or the grey rat, Rattus norvegicus. Okay, so why I would be interested in rats as an archaeologist? Well, there are really four main reasons why an archaeologist might be interested in species like rats, or for that matter the house mouse, Mus musculus, in commensal species. So in rodent species, not necessarily rodent species, but in this case rodent species which live in and around human settlements and which can often become dependent to some extent on the environments that humans create. Perhaps the most obvious thing that comes up whenever I talk to, especially to people who are not archaeologists or historians or zoologists about rats, the first thing that comes to mind is often disease, and particularly, of course, plague, Yersinia pestis, the Black Death. What comes to mind more for archaeologists is often reconstructing environments. So the majority of archaeologists who study small mammals, rodents and other small mammals, are doing it in order to reconstruct environments. Now, most of the time that people study small mammals, they're doing it in prehistory, and it's an attempt to study kind of broad environments around settlements, environmental reconstruction on kind of a landscape scale. When you start looking at commensal species, and things like mice and rats, you're very often looking at reconstructing environments on a much more focused scale of the environments in and around human settlements themselves. So for example, this reconstruction is of Viking Age Jorvik. There is a famous museum in York, where I'm from, or where I'm working, the Jorvik Viking Centre, which has a reconstruction and lots of kind of animated models and so on of people living in Viking York. They include, amongst other things, rats in their scene around York, because we found them there archaeologically. So they consulted with the archaeologists who said we had rats present, so when they reconstruct what the city was like, they include rats. The other main reasons people look at commensal species in archaeology, one of them is to look at migration. So this has particularly been used in island settings. So for example, this picture here is Polynesia. People have used the Pacific rat, for example, which is a species of rat we find in Southeast Asia and onto the Pacific Islands. They've used it to track human dispersal. So particularly using genetics, you can see the process by which rodents have reached one island and then the next island and so on. And you can use that as a proxy for the way that humans have moved. Slightly more subtle than that, but what I'm personally most interested in, is actually looking at not at initial colonization by animals or for that matter by people, but looking at trade and communications. So looking at the extent to which different settlements in the antique period and the medieval period were connected to each other, connected to the world outside. And I'll explain why I think rats are useful for that now. Okay, so a common theme that comes up here is the idea of human-mediated dispersal. So there are animals which humans have deliberately moved around the world. So domestic species, livestock, we were talking about chickens earlier. Chickens have been moved around the world from South Asia originally by humans as animals that they're deliberately using. There are other species which have moved around the world with humans, but not due to the humans' deliberate intentions. And rats obviously fall into that category. Now, where the ability to colonize a human settlement environment allows an animal to spread outside its original native range, you can get a situation emerging where that species is to some extent dependent on the environments created by humans. So you get this idea of anthro-dependent populations. So it doesn't mean they can't live away from humans, but it means that over the long term, populations are unlikely to be sustained away from human settlements, which is what I think is the situation with rats in Europe, and certainly with the black rat in Europe. Archaeologically speaking, where you find those species, so if I find black rats, which as you'll see in a moment are originally from South Asia, if I find black rats in a settlement in Finland, that's a pretty good evidence, firstly, that the human settlement created the right conditions for rats, so a suitably dense settlement with shelter, with food and so on, suitable for rats, but also it's evidence of that colonization opportunity, that there was the movement of humans that allowed rats to get there in the first place. Because we're not talking about animals that can move long distances on their own accord. So people have used this a lot, and as I mentioned just now, people have most often used rats to look at human dispersals in places like the Pacific. More recently, there was this paper on the right here that came out last year, which looked at both chickens and rats and used them as evidence for trade contacts between the Arabian Peninsula and southern India and East Africa. So the first arrival of black rats, which are an Asian species to begin with, in East Africa, seems to coincide with the expansion of Arab trade. So in the period that we would call the medieval in Europe, they're often, sometimes it's called the medieval in Africa, sometimes they use other terminology, but around kind of the 10th century and onwards. Okay, so for the uninitiated, the two species of rat that we find in Europe today are firstly the Rattus norvegicus, the brown rat or the grey rat, in English often called the common rat or the Norway rat, which it depends. I'm going to come back to brown rats a little bit at the end. They're not the point of this talk, but there is a lot of disagreement about precisely when they did reach Europe. In Western Europe, we tend to say 17th, 18th century they arrived. The assumption seems to be that they came overland from Asia, although as I'll mention again at the end, I'm not sure about that. This is a species probably from relatively far north in Asia, which thrives in temperate conditions. It's larger, it's also more aggressive than the black rat, and it's the main species in Europe today. So in large parts of Europe, it is now the only species of rat. So in most of Northern Europe, in almost all of Britain, we no longer have black rats, we only have brown rats. So I'm not sure quite what the situation is in Ukraine, but most places I go to talk, I always say to the audience, if you see rats around in your day-to-day life, they're probably brown rat. Okay. Is that the case here? Do you mainly have brown rats in Ukraine these days?
Yes, there are, sure.
Okay. But the species I'm actually more interested in archaeologically is Rattus rattus, the black rat, also known in English as the ship rat or the roof rat. In both cases related to the fact that it's actually a very good climber, that in the wild climb trees fairly often, and when living in human settlements is often found in the roof. It's originally from South Asia, and I'll come to that in a bit more detail in a second. It's a smaller species, it's less aggressive, it's less cold adapted, and in recent centuries it seems to have been widely replaced by the brown rat across most of Europe. Now my argument is that because this species is not actually that well adapted to the European climate, it's a good proxy for human activity. So where we find black rats in archaeological sites, we know that we have the right kind of settlement, but probably also that we have regular contact between settlements, because over the long term, it would be unlikely to survive without some form of population exchange. Okay. So what we actually know so far about the spread of black rat? There's been remarkably little modern DNA work done. Now, the brown rat is one of the genetically best known species in the world because it is the lab rat. So the lab rat is the speaking. There actually isn't much research on the brown rat in the wild, but there is a huge amount under laboratory conditions. The black rat has barely been studied genetically at all. There is very little research. This is a paper from 2011. There have been a few more studies since, but this still basically summarizes most of what we know. So that gives you some idea how little we know about black rat genetics. The key point here is there are actually, I think, 6 or 7 lineages of black rat, most of which are confined to Southeast Asia, and I won't talk about any more because they never left Southeast Asia. However, lineage 1 and lineage 2, lineage 1 in blue, lineage 2 in red, are the lineages which have spread further around the world. And in particular, lineage 1 seems to have started in South Asia, South India, and that's the variant that appears to have reached Europe. So black rat that have been, modern black rat that have been sampled in Europe appear to be descended from black rat from India, whereas those that you find way down into island Southeast Asia seem to have come from mainland Southeast Asia previously. There is then a separation between, there is then a separation between a Madagascan sublineage and a European sublineage of lineage 1. So it appears that fairly early on there was a break. Now what you might notice on here is we actually only have one data point from Europe. That is not a single specimen, that is a single study. A few years after this study, that one data point was expanded, but nonetheless the only modern DNA we have from Europe is from the central Mediterranean. This was an Italian team, so as you can see most of the samples are from Italy, but they also have some from southern France and from North Africa. And what this showed is that there appears to have been a genetic radiation in the central Mediterranean basin. They conclude, based on this, a single, quotes, fairly recent invasion. So the argument here is that all the sites they sampled around the central Mediterranean showed that there had probably been a single, and this is just an old-fashioned mitochondrial DNA haplogroups. Nobody has done full genome work on black rats yet. In fact, there isn't a published genome for black rats, although there is one that has just been sequenced and hopefully will be published soon by the Max Planck in Jena. So just based on traditional mitochondrial haplogroups, it looks like there is this expansion in the central Mediterranean. So the argument is there was a single invasion at some point in the recent past, and they don't specify how long ago they think recent might be. That has then resulted in the population of much of the central Mediterranean. Okay. So that doesn't tell us very much. If you're taking away from this that we really don't seem to know much about it, that's exactly the right thing to take away. We don't know much about the genetics at all. Which is why I think it's, well, I think it would be important to turn to the archaeological data anyway, but it's particularly important given how little we know from it. And at this point I want to emphasize that I am not the first person to look at this. There have been various people in the past who have summarized the archaeological data. These are 3 of the key studies here. So I have Philip Armitage, who studied some material from York and from London, and then kind of did a study where he expanded out beyond that. There is a big paper by a French team from 1994. This is actually not the original, this is 1997 I think, but they had a series of papers in the 90s where they surveyed a lot of the data from Western Europe in particular. And then there's a paper by Michael McCormick, the historian, which is up until now the most thorough, the most complete survey that's been done. He published that in 2003. 10 years later he put the database online, so there is an online database of all the samples he included in this. So what I've been doing is taking these existing databases, adding to them, expanding to countries that weren't represented in any of the previous studies, and also going back and checking some of the older sources. And inevitably, in any kind of fairly large database, and I should say that McCormick built on Adwan Rousseau and Vin's work, there are some mistakes in this database. That's inevitable. If you compile a database, you'll make mistakes. And some of them actually change the story a little bit when you go back and correct them. Okay, So with no further ado, I'll give you an idea of what the archaeological data actually say. Now the first thing I should mention is that there is some evidence for Pleistocene specimens of Rattus in some parts of Europe. I'm not going to get into that. I don't know how solid that evidence is. In any case, I'm only going to talk about the Holocene. So there may or may not have been some kind of Rattus, not necessarily Rattus in the Pleistocene, but I'm not going to talk about that. Moving to the Holocene, there are actually very few finds from before the current era, so from before 1 AD. I've plotted a few of them on here. This is not exhaustive. I haven't been focusing on the earliest finds, I'm looking at later ones. But the colour scheme here are red finds are ones that are reported but that I don't trust. And in many cases, the people who publish them also don't trust them, so they say, for example, this site down here, Capo d'Alfieri in Italy, I think that's the name of the site. The zooarchaeologist who studied it actually says, well, we found black rat here, but this is a Neolithic site, so I don't actually believe it's really there. It must be intrusive. Okay. So the red dots are dots that either the original publisher or I don't believe in. Yellow dots are slightly more secure cases. This one, for example, is underneath Pompeii. It's not in the final phase of Pompeii, it's in an earlier phase, but that makes it pretty secure. This Egyptian case is actually inside a mummy, so again, that makes it fairly secure. This is only 1st century BC and it's from a very good context in Morocco. The two green points here have been carbon dated. Now the key point here is that all of the more reliable finds, with the exception of this one in Slovenia, in fact, all of the more reliable finds are from the last few centuries BC. So from kind of 400 BC to 50 BC maybe, including both the carbon dated finds. So probably we're talking about black rat reaching the Mediterranean in the second half of the first millennium BC. So after about 500 BC. Okay. Then, if you move into what I'm calling the Roman period, now bear in mind, I'm being very Anglo-centric here because the Roman invasion of England is in 43 AD. So I kind of think of Roman as starting at 1. Obviously, actually, the Roman period goes several centuries earlier. But nonetheless, if we move up to the Imperial Roman period, we find suddenly there are rats over a very large area of Europe. And an area which almost entirely coincides with the Roman Empire. So there is this one case. I want to get hold of these in carbon data just to make sure. But there is only really one find that is firmly outside the Roman Empire. Now, why do we have this pattern? Well, given what we know of the ecology of the black rat, this actually makes a lot of sense. We know that in the Roman period, in much of Europe, you start to get larger, denser settlements than you previously had. That's not necessarily the case in all of the Mediterranean, but certainly in northwest Europe, Iron Age settlements are very rarely on the scale of Roman towns. We know that you start to get regular bulk trade, including both commercial bulk trade and kind of, let's say, government-facilitated, state-organised bulk provisioning as well. You have regular military supply lines, and this is something which is a bit of a cliche. Whenever you talk about the Romans, people want to talk about the army, but on the other hand, you did have a very large body of soldiery who were supplied in a very organised manner with substantial pack trains, and all of that involved moving perishable goods along efficient roads, long distances, in wheeled vehicles and on boats, all of which are very good ways of spreading mice and rats around Europe. On top of all that, the Roman period is a period of relative climatic warmth. So you have, again, if we're talking about a species which is not originally adapted to a temperate European climate, the fact that the Roman period is relatively warm may also have assisted this process. Nonetheless, I think more important is this issue of settlements and trade. And what I would argue is that while we don't only find rats in big cities, we also find rats in some Roman villas, particularly in the late Roman period. But Roman villas, while they're quite small settlements, they also tend to be very well connected. So they tend to have very regular, they kind of act as hubs of trade in some cases, but they certainly are well provisioned from that side. So they tend to be on trade routes, often on rivers, and you have a lot of goods coming in and out. So my argument here, and I'm certainly not the first person to argue this, but the argument here is that rat populations in this period were dependent on the Roman economic system as a whole. So the combination of the settlement pattern and the amount of communications and trade. Now, obviously, that system eventually breaks down. So the question then is, what happens to rats when that Roman economic system starts to fall apart from the 5th century onwards? And for this I'm zooming in on some kind of 200-year blocks, or 300-year blocks rather. So this is the last 3 centuries of kind of the classical Roman period. Obviously when you decide the Roman period ends is a matter of opinion, but I'm saying 3rd to 5th centuries. The last 300 years, as you can see, we have a lot of rat finds along the frontiers, along the Rhine frontier, the Danube frontier, and a significant number elsewhere in the empire as well. If we move into the 6th to 8th century, we have almost none at all north of the Mediterranean. This find, I should say, from Ves, is actually probably later, so it's from a relatively early layer, but the people who published it, it's Olga Krajlovic and Arkady Savinetsky, argue that actually, even though it's from that layer, there is some mixing, and probably the rat bones are actually from the 12th to 13th century layers. Hopefully they're going to send me one of the bones and we're going to get it dated to find out. But I put this here because technically it is from that layer, but it's probably actually a later find. So instead we only have a couple of finds. I have no particular reason to doubt these finds. This, the dating is quite questionable again. It's probably 8th century, but it might be later. But it's certainly towards the end of this period in any case. Okay, so it seems we have a period after the end of the Roman Empire where we still have rats on various places in the Mediterranean. We still have them in quite a few Byzantine sites, but we're not finding them in Northern Europe. And I should say, if you look at Iberia here, we have no data from Iberia, but we also have virtually no sites that have been studied, where they have studied the microfauna. So I wouldn't take this seriously. We don't know if there were rats in Iberia or not. We don't have positive evidence or negative evidence. But for Northern Europe, lots of sites have been studied, and we just don't seem to have rats in this period. So when the Roman system collapses, at least in the north of Europe, the ability for rat populations to survive seems to go along with it. But then something quite interesting happens, which is if you move into the 9th to 11th centuries, we suddenly get a whole load more data, we suddenly get a whole load more finds of rats, and particularly in the north of Europe. So actually now we don't have any data from the Mediterranean. Now there are 2 possible things going on here. One is that from the 7th, from the 8th century onwards, there is a massive loss of, the Byzantine Empire loses a lot of land in the Balkans, and also there is a breakup of Mediterranean trade related to the, or a breakup of Roman-dominated, European-dominated Mediterranean trade due to the Arab invasions of North Africa and Iberia. More importantly, I think, though, there is the fact that in much of southern Europe, medieval archaeologists are less inclined to sieve their bones than Roman archaeologists. Whereas in northern Europe, medieval archaeologists seem to be more inclined to sieve their bones than sieve their finds than Roman archaeologists. So actually, I think the lack of data from southern Europe in this period is probably a research bias. I would like to think it's to do with the Slavic invasions of the Balkans and the Arab invasions of North Africa, but that is probably over-interpreting. It's probably simply that people haven't been doing such intensive sieving of archaeological deposits in this period. So one thing I would like to do with this project is to fill in some of those gaps, particularly in Iberia. Okay. Now you'll have noticed, hopefully, that all of these, the way I've plotted this data is using the midpoints of the date ranges. Now that's obviously problematic because archaeological dating is often quite vague, so many of these points might actually have ended up on the wrong maps. If they're dated 7th to 9th century, but actually they're dated at the very beginning of the 7th century, they're going to turn up on the wrong map. So that's all a bit problematic. So one thing I've been working on is using plotting frequency curves over time, incorporating dating uncertainty instead. So doing a simulation where you take the date range for every find, and you simulate dates within that, you run it 2,000 times, 5,000 times, whatever you need for it to resolve, and then you can plot frequencies with a confidence interval around them. And what we see from this, and I should say this is an unclean data set, it's a work in progress, none of these results are final. I suspect quite a lot of these finds actually are going to get resolved when we check them. But what we can see quite clearly is this 5th century, or rather decline from the 5th into the 6th century across the whole of Europe. If we split northern and southern Europe based on above or below 47 degrees north, which is pretty arbitrary, again we see this kind of 6th century decline in the north, and we see a much later 8th century decline in the south. But again, I suspect that's more research bias than anything else. In both cases, we see the numbers going right back up in the High Medieval period. If we break northern Europe down a bit, and apologies if you can't read the writing on here, the green at the top is England, then we have Belgium and the Netherlands, then we have France, and then we have Scandinavia and Baltic countries at the bottom. you can see that there are some slightly different timings to when we stopped seeing evidence for rats in the different countries that were part of the Roman world. And in the far north, in Scandinavia and the Baltic states, which were not part of the Roman world, we first start to see rats appearing in any decent numbers, any decent degree of confidence, into the 9th century. Okay, so what I'm going to do for the next part of the talk is focus on this Northern European picture, because it is, for the medieval period at least, where we have the most data, basically, where we have the most thorough coverage of data. And also it tells quite an interesting story. So I'm going to start off very parochially, very Anglo-centrically from Britain, and I'll justify that on the basis that a lot of the early research on rat biogeography was done based in Britain. And in fact, there was a find from London, actually no, a find from York, which was the first concrete evidence of rats before the medieval period in Europe. So the first kind of concretely published find from the Roman period. Or so I thought, until I saw, I'm going to mispronounce the name now, Peter Blishko, who actually published rats from 1956. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So actually, there were published Roman rats from Ukraine well before any of the stuff done in Britain. However, that's not widely known outside Ukraine. So a lot of the kind of the more visible early publications are from Britain. So we have rats in a lot of Roman towns in Britain. We have them in Eboracum, otherwise known as York. We have them in Londinium, otherwise known as London. We also have them in quite a few smaller towns, in a few Roman villas and so on. We don't have them in every town. So Winchester, for example, was quite a large Roman town, but also quite isolated. It wasn't a port, it was further inland, and we don't find them there. So it seems that communication routes are as important as the size of the town. If we go to post-Roman England, well, there is a lot of controversy, there is a lot of argument amongst people who study the Roman period and the early medieval period about the extent to which this idea of the Roman Empire collapsing completely in the Dark Age is really valid. If there is one place in Europe where that is really valid, or most valid, then it is Britain. So the most extreme case of change between the Roman period and the subsequent period is Britain. We virtually cease to see urban settlements overnight. There are massive changes in material culture, there are massive changes in pretty much any type of archaeology you care to mention, very rapidly at the end of the Roman period. So the nature of settlements changes enormously, and the degree of trade reduces enormously. And unsurprisingly, therefore, we see in post-Roman England there are very few, if any, rats. There are a few claimed specimens, all of which that I've looked at so far closely have something dubious about them. So that's the kind of the immediately post-Roman period. Not surprising that we don't have rats. Once you get to the 7th and 8th centuries, we actually start to see the development of a fairly extensive trade network across northern Europe, around the North Sea and around the Baltic Sea, known as the Northern Emporia. Now two of those, or several of those emporia were Saxon settlements referred to as wicks, which there are at least four major wicks in England, and there's also Quentin in France. The two which have had the most intensive research done on them are again York and London. So Eofor Wick is late Saxon York, or mid-Saxon rather. London Wick is mid-Saxon London. And these are both sites which have had plenty of study of small mammals, and there are plenty of mice in each case, but there are no known rats in each case. So even when we start to see this extensive trade network developing across northern Europe, we don't see the return of rats. If we cross the channel to continental Europe, Ribe on the Danish coast, same story, we don't see any rats. Dorestad, a particularly large trading settlement in the Netherlands, again we don't see any rats. I should add though, there's not been much study of microfauna here. The recovery wasn't amazing, so both of these sites do have mouse specimens recorded, but only very small numbers. So I'm not so sure about these as I am about the two English sites. And I could list a load more sites where this applies to, but these are just some of the biggest, best known sites. Then, if we move into the 9th century, and particularly into the middle and the end of the 9th century, we start to see rats appearing again. And they appear at York, in Jorvik, so the Anglo-Scandinavian levels of York, the Viking Age levels of York. They appear in Birka, which is up here near Stockholm, a big Viking Age trading settlement again from the, I think 829 is the beginning of the dating for the first phase that has any rats in, so mid-9th century. And probably also in Hellebu. So there are lots of rats reported from Hellebu, it's a Danish settlement, it's now in Germany, but Hellebu is the Danish name. There are lots of rats reported, but the zooarchaeologists who reported them didn't refer to the phasing of the site. So within the about 200 years it's occupied, I don't know exactly when those bones are from. So they might be earlier than Birka and York if they're from the very earliest phase, or they might be later if they're from the very latest phase. I don't know. But they're certainly consistent with the same pattern. So what I kind of suggest based on this, and based on a few other less well-known settlements with less good dating and that kind of thing, is that we may have basically a 9th century Viking Age rat horizon. So where rats reappear across northern Europe fairly rapidly in the mid-9th century. So yeah, we have no firm finds before about here. Birka is one of the earliest, and then after that we start to see them coming in more and more sites. So we need to get more data to fill this out, and we particularly need more data from the eastern part of the Baltic. But based on kind of fairly well-known, well-published sites, it looks like there may be this Viking Age phenomenon. And that then raises the question of what was the route by which they spread. So from the point of view of somebody looking at Jorvik, looking at York, if you think, well, suddenly we had Roman rats, they went away in the Saxon period, they came back with the Vikings, the assumption would be if they came with the Vikings, they're coming from the Baltic. But the Baltic is an even more unexpected place to find what is essentially a South Indian species turning up in the 9th century. So the question then is, how did they get to the Baltic? And there are really two possibilities here. One is that actually there was a revival of rat populations in France, in the Carolingian world, so what you might call the Carolingian renaissance of rats, and that they then spread back up into the Baltic secondarily after reaching Western Europe. The other possibility is that they reached the eastern Baltic via the riverine trade along Volga and the Daugava and Dnieper, which starts to lead you to realise why I'm in Ukraine at the moment, in which case we'd have a west to east spread. So, I have a small project funded by the British Academy where I'm trying to resolve this question as far as we can. And this is a very small pilot project. We don't have money to do any DNA or anything like that, although we have done some pilot DNA, but we can't do anything substantial. But the idea here is just to collate data from across the region, working with local colleagues, so I have kind of a partnership with one or more specialists in most of the countries involved, and we're filling in some gaps by studying a few previously unstudied assemblages, particularly things from new excavations, stuff that's just coming out of the ground at the moment. We're checking some of the key finds that might change the story, so the earliest finds in particular countries, or finds that are unexpected for some reason or other, with radiocarbon and with zooms. Now it might seem surprising that you could radiocarbon date a rat bone, and maybe 10 years ago it would have been a bit of a stretch, but radiocarbon dating is getting better all the time, and these days it's quite feasible, at least from this relatively recent period, relatively cold climates, it's very feasible to date a rat bone. In fact, the bone we have on here, the specimen that's represented by both of these graphs, is actually from Roman Portugal, so it is both earlier and from a warmer country than any of the northern European places I'm looking at. And we managed to get from, it was a fragment of pelvis that weighed 0.21 grams, so really quite a small fragment. We got a perfectly good carbon date out of it, and we also got a species ID confirmation using zooms, which is zooarchaeology by mass spectroscopy, which is a collagen fingerprinting method. So a method that can fortunately distinguish between black rat and brown rat, and obviously other rodents, from a very small amount of bone. So that's something that we're using quite a lot in this project to confirm identifications. Whenever we date a sample, we take a small bit of the collagen to get zooms as well, so that we can be 100% sure what we're dating. Okay. We've also done a little bit of pilot DNA work, and right now I have a collaboration with Oxford and with Jena, so rather than doing this myself, I'm not a geneticist, we're sending some samples off to them, where we have sufficient material to do that. We're also planning on looking into geometric morphometrics. This is a graph from a paper by Arden Holm Beeman, where he's showing that you can separate black rat from brown rat by the shape of their teeth, by geometric morphometrics. More importantly, I think, we're also thinking we could do GMM on the mandibles to try and pick up adaptive signals. So by looking at morphometrics, one thing you can look for is phylogenetic signals, particularly from teeth, which are relatively conserved. Mandibles may give us a better signal of kind of convergent adaptations to different conditions. So the holy grail would be to pick up kind of an urban settlement signal in mandibular morphology, which, given how rapidly rats can adapt, given their short generation times and high selection, is actually quite feasible. Okay, so most recently I've been working in the Eastern Baltic, where I've been trying to fill in some of these gaps to try and firm up this idea of whether we have rats moving from east to west or from west to east. And there are three possible hypotheses a priori for when rats reach the countries of the Eastern Baltic. One, and this is kind of the default hypothesis amongst many of the local archaeologists you talk to, is that they arrived along with German and Scandinavian colonization, which is broadly speaking the 13th century. So Finland is heavily settled by Swedes, the northern part of Estonia is annexed by the Danish crown in the early 13th century, around the beginning of the 13th century anyway, and there is obviously the Northern Crusades in which substantial parts of the Eastern Baltic littoral are colonized and settled by German populations. For example, most famously the Teutonic Order, and the Livonian Order further north, but also a whole range of independent German crusading groups, and you get a series of bishoprics set up around the area. We know that a lot of those sites have rat bones in them. So Teutonic Order castles quite often have rat bones in them. What we don't really know so much about is earlier periods, so I've been trying to look into that a little bit. So the next possibility is that they arrived in the Viking Age or the Fine Lion Age from the west, so around the same time that we find them in Sweden and in Denmark and in northern Germany and in northern England, they may be arriving in the same area. Okay. The other possibility is that they're actually in the Eastern Baltic a little bit earlier than they get to the west, so before about 850, in which case you could make an argument that they're spreading from the south and east along the river in trade routes. Distinguishing between these two is going to be a little bit difficult because actually the dating is likely to be very close, and maybe the differences between the east and west will be beyond the resolution we can get with carbon dating, certainly, but we'll see. But certainly we should be able to say whether this is the situation or whether this is the situation. Okay, so these are the results we have so far. Now some of these are new finds that nobody previously knew about, that we found in boxes of unrecorded bones. Most of them, however, are finds which have been studied before for somebody's MSc dissertation or somebody's PhD, but were never published and were in an archive somewhere on a shelf and are not known of outside the university in which the PhD was written or the master's was written. So I'm not trying to claim this is all my work. Mostly this is a matter of working with local colleagues to find all these not so well-known, semi-published finds and pull it all together. But this is what we find. The bars in grey are fairly concrete finds, good dating, definite identifications. The bars in white are more dubious finds. Most of them I'm confident of the identification, but not necessarily of the dating, either because it's very broad, or because there's possible mixing, or it's just suspiciously early. So what we're going to try to do is carbon date a whole load of these. So each of these finds we're intending to carbon date. If we only look at the black bars for now and ignore the things that aren't firmly dated, then it seems we have a relatively late appearance of rats in the Eastern Baltic, so 12th century, let's say, which would then imply that they're coming from the west, probably. So they're coming subsequent to, and we will never really know the direction without doing genetics, which is the next step, but it would point towards them having come from the west. If, however, some of these finds turn out to be genuine, then we have a more interesting story on our hands. Particularly if this is from Kjava Hillforten from Linnalusta in Estonia. If these turn out to be towards the beginning of that date range, then we may have to reverse the picture and see it as an east to west spread. But we will see. Unfortunately, at this point, I can't give you the final answer to this because we're still, in fact, we haven't even submitted the samples for dating yet. But within 6 months or so, hopefully, I'll have a firmer idea of what's going on around. Now, I realise at this point I meant to have a next slide, which was a map of Europe again, and highlighting Ukraine to explain how this all fits in. But the obvious point here is that if we find that we have rats reaching the Baltic from the east and south, then the assumption is where they're coming from is either the Pontic world or the Caspian world or both. Now this would make a lot of sense, given that in around the 7th, 8th century, some of the most populous and most, say, 8th to 9th century, some of the most populous places in Eurasia and some of the most kind of intense trade networks in Eurasia are the Byzantine world and the early Islamic world. And these are places where there hasn't been much work done on ancient rats, a little bit in the Byzantine world, rather less in the early Islamic world, but I would be very surprised, we certainly know there are rats in many parts of the Byzantine world, I'd be very surprised if there were not black rats present in a lot of early Islamic sites, but there hasn't been all that much research done, at least not research that I'm aware of. But they would make a lot of sense as sources for a spread along those riverine trade routes up to the eastern Baltic. On the other hand, spread through Western Europe along the Po Valley from places like Venice and Comacchio, some of the early Adriatic emporia, and then along the Rhine to places like Dorestad, would also make a lot of sense. And it's quite possible that we have both an eastern and a western route, which we will never be able to piece together without DNA. But one of the major routes would involve basically the Kiev and Rus trade routes. So while I've been here in Kiev for the last couple of days, I've particularly been trying to look at material from Kiev and Rus sites, because if there are rats present in those sites, then it's a feasible source for getting to the Baltic. If there are not rats present in those sites, then it becomes a less feasible source. Now, of course, we can never prove absence, but it's all a matter of kind of the balance of evidence. Okay, so that's all I've got up to in terms of the biogeography. I can't give you any conclusions at this point, because it's all a work in progress, but I'm going to finish on a couple of slightly different issues, which I think I'm getting more and more interested in as I go about doing this research. So a couple of issues that were not the point of this project, but which I'm kind of getting drawn into along the way, and which hopefully will be interesting. One of them is the question of rats and plague. So the first thing, if you say to a member of the public that you're working on medieval rats, the first thing they will tend to say is that to do with plague? Because there is the traditional model for the spread of plague, is that it was spread by rat fleas and rats. So rat was a reservoir, fleas as the vector, and that's how it was being spread to humans. How it was being sustained amongst human populations and spread across, well, not just across Europe, but across actually much of the world. That model is based on work in the third plague pandemic, particularly in the 19th century in India. India and also Hong Kong, where there was quite a lot of research done at the time on it. Now, it was that research that revealed that plague is in fact bacterium Yersinia pestis, and that also revealed the rat flea route, the rat flea mechanism. So a lot of our understanding of plague in the Black Death and the Justinianic plague is based on analogy with what we know of the 19th century plague in Asia, which did unequivocally involve rats. However, there's been a lot of research recently where people are arguing that rats may not have played a major role in previous plague spreads. So this is a paper by a guy called Boris Schmidt, is the senior author here. He did a paper himself a few years previously, and his group have been doing a lot of, he's a plague biologist, they've been doing a lot of simulation modelling, and they argue that the rate of spread, as documented historically, so if you quantify the outbreaks in different places, the timing doesn't fit a rat model very well in most cases, and it fits a human ectoparasite model better. I'm not qualified to assess the veracity of that argument, but it seems like a convincing case. There's also been work done, particularly, this is a Norwegian partnership, Anna Karin Huftamer is a zoologist as well as a biologist, and they've demonstrated that actually in the medieval period, in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries in Norway, there are very few rat finds, and the finds we do have are almost entirely from major urban sites. But of course the plague also hit the rural areas just as badly. So their argument is, well, if we don't have rats in the rural areas and yet we have plague, rats cannot have been a necessary condition for plague. Another argument people have been using more recently is that we now know there was Yersinia pestis present in the Bronze Age in Europe thanks to the pathogen geneticists. However, and if it was present in the Bronze Age, well before we had rats, then obviously rats were involved. However, that Bronze Age strain is a different strain of Yersinia pestis, so that could be a whole different story. I don't have a position on this, I should say. This debate can get extremely heated. There is another Norwegian scholar called Ole Benedictov who takes the opposite view and takes the traditionalist view, and the exchanges between them in print and in person can get quite, let's say, heated, quite angry. So it's something I want to kind of stay out of. What I'm trying to do is compile, in the course of doing this work, compile an empirical data set which these guys can take and use to have their argument about plague. However, having said that, right now, if you look at all the finds we have in Europe, which more or less, I should say actually in each of these maps I've shown you, I forgot to mention this earlier, there are some finds we know of from the Volga region. I haven't put them on this map because they're not published and I don't have explicit permission to put them on this map, but there are some other finds from Russia. Not that many, but a few. Okay, so if we look at all the finds excluding the Volga region, which overlap, broadly speaking, with the Black Death. Actually, we have a very good coverage of Europe. We certainly have rats even in the far north. However, the further north you go, the more they seem to be restricted to urban sites. So I think actually Anna Karin Hufdammer had a point, and it is quite difficult to sustain the idea of plague based on that reason. On the other hand, there's been less research on rural sites in most areas. So I'm still not 100% sure about that. However, I think actually if you really want to set out to disprove the idea that plague depended on rats, you're better off forgetting the Black Death altogether and looking instead at the Justinianic plague, which is 1541 to 1542 as the original major plague outbreak, but then it continues at a lower intensity until about the 8th century, so there are repeated outbreaks after that. And this is precisely the period in Western Europe, and in Northern Europe for that matter, where we don't have rats present. So precisely the period where we do not have rats is the period of the Justinianic plague. In the north, we do have rats in much of the Mediterranean still at this point. Now traditionally the Justinianic plague was considered to be a broadly Mediterranean phenomenon. So the historical accounts of it come from Byzantine sources primarily. Justinian had just reconquered much of the Mediterranean for the Byzantine Empire, so much of the old Western Roman Empire was kind of reincorporated temporarily into the Eastern Roman Empire at that point, and we know that the plague spread around that area. However, the fact that we don't have historical documents on the plague from beyond that area doesn't tell us very much, because we also just don't have historical documents from beyond that area in anything like the same numbers. So actually the limits of the Justinianic plague we really don't know very well. And there's been a lot of speculation it may have been much more widespread. Recently, again, the plague geneticists, pathogen geneticists, particularly in Jena, have published a few papers showing that we actually do have 6th century cases of Yersinia pestis in burials, so they live in human tooth roots normally, from this period. So it looks, based on the genetics, that in France there is even an as yet unpublished find from England that actually we do have evidence that the Justinianic plague made it to France and made it to England. Now if that turns out to be the case on a more widespread basis, then the fact that this is precisely the period where we have really quite firm evidence for there not being any significant number of rats around is, I think, going to be a much more convincing argument against the idea that rats were crucial in plague than anything we have from the Black Death. I say I have no personal dog in this fight, but I kind of suspect that this is the way it's going. Okay. The final thing I want to say is just a slight digression into the brown rat. Now I put at the top here challenging conventional wisdom because I made this slide first of all for a talk I gave in Finland, and in Finland the conventional wisdom on the brown rat is quite similar to what it is in England. Talking to Pavel more recently here, I realised that actually the conventional wisdom in Ukraine is rather different anyway, so we have a slightly different story. But what I found with kind of reading into the black rat and the brown rat is that different people have very different ideas of when the brown rat reached their countries, and that a lot of that, particularly in Northern and Western Europe, which I know best, isn't actually based on very much. So it's based on some kind of early scientific accounts saying we now have a different species of rat present, which is quite firm evidence, but it doesn't necessarily tell you that they weren't present at all prior to that. There is no real genetic evidence, certainly no archaeogenetic evidence. We can now use zooms, collagen fingerprinting to tell black and brown rat apart, but nobody has yet tried to do that. The morphological criteria, well, they're reliable on skulls, but there are questions about how reliable they are on other elements, and it seems that criteria developed in one region don't necessarily work very well in another region. So actually, I think the evidence for when we first get brown rats in Europe is really quite thin at the moment. The conventional wisdom is that, at least the conventional wisdom of Western Europe, is that they arrive in the 17th to 18th century overland from Asia. And people will say, well, trade with Asia is how they got to Europe. On the other hand, we know they were in Asia well before that, and we know that substantial east-west Eurasian trade existed well before that. So you can ask the question of why did brown rats reach Europe when they did and not before? Now, if you go to Denmark, for example, they will tell you that brown rats arrived into Copenhagen with the Russian fleet. Which is quite plausible, but it would be very surprising if those were the very first brown rats to reach Denmark. I'm kind of torn on this, but I looked at a couple of recent genetic papers that came out, and I should say that this one, Zay et al. 2017, my geneticist colleagues tell me they don't think is a very reliable paper. I'm not qualified to make that judgment, but people are quite sceptical about this one. Now, Zeng et al. Argued, based on modern genetics, and this was a full genome study, based on modern genetics, that actually the brown rat might come from Southeast Asia after all, and not from further north as previously thought. Now, the problem here is it's currently spread throughout most of the world, so you need to use genetics to work out where it came from. You can't do that any other way. They argue that it may actually have reached the Middle East as much as 3,000 years ago and reached Europe 1,800 years ago, so around the same time that the black rat is reaching Europe. Now, I don't believe this is the case, but what is interesting here is that they're suggesting that the populations which have given rise to rats across most of the world are coming from Southeast Asia, and not from further north. The other paper here, Puckett et al. 2016, they did some genome work. I think these are mitochondrial haplogroups. Is that actually, you can see this blue haplogroup here, which probably, based on what we know of the spread in the last, with European colonialism, probably arose within Europe and spread from there. What you can also see is that some of the other genetic types we find in Europe actually match more closely onto Southeast Asia than anywhere else. Now, this is currently very tenuous, and note that they have no data from Eastern Europe at all, and only very little from Central Asia. But I'm starting to suspect that maybe actually brown rats reached Western Europe with colonial shipping. So with British, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish shipping directly with South Asia. The question then is, did we also have brown rats coming overland into Eastern Europe at the same time? So do we potentially have spread from two different directions? The colonial shipping argument would explain the timing, would explain why rats reached Western Europe at that point and not previously, because the scale of shipping between Western Europe and Asia was much higher at that point than ever before. An alternative hypothesis for the spread, if it was an overland spread, could be that it's climate driven, but it seems a little bit too late for that. So the Little Ice Age, in making Europe colder, would increase the advantage of the brown rats over the black rats, and so could have been the trigger for that colonisation. On the other hand, it seems that colonisation, at least into Central and Western Europe, was a century or two too late really to be explained by climatic events. So I don't believe that's probably the case. But this is something that I'd quite like to get into researching in the future. So I just thought I'd finish with that. So I'm going to finish then with a load of acknowledgements. As I said before, I don't have conclusions because this is a work in progress and I haven't yet concluded anything. But I'd just like to say many, many people have given me data or samples so far, hence this huge name. And I've highlighted a few people on here, some of whom are in the room. Thanks. Any questions?
Okay, I have stupid questions. May I have stupid questions? I'm sorry. I'm not an archaeologist and I'm not even a zoologist, so how can you explain that in York, for example, you have the appearance and then disappearance of rats? I mean, this settlement is probably constant, but not really.
Well, it is and it isn't. So after the end of the Roman period, so during the Roman period there is a legionary fortress and there is a colonium, a fairly dense walled settlement. They are abandoned, well, the fortress is actually abandoned before that, but after the end of the Roman period, the colonia is also abandoned. Around the same time, a little bit later, a Saxon trading settlement develops downstream, and by the 7th, 8th centuries, that's developed into a fairly large trading settlement. But there is the early Saxon period. Yes, we think there was still occupation in York, but it wasn't within the walled city itself, and it was at a much lower intensity than previously. So this, the town wasn't abandoned entirely, but the settlement shifted, it became much smaller, much less dense, and perhaps most importantly, much less well connected. So, and same story in London as well.
Perhaps I'm wrong, but I have read something that in Eastern Europe, brown rats came with the Mongol invasion. Do you know anything about that? Can you comment on this?
Yeah, and that's one that I hadn't actually previously heard, but that falls again into the same kind of category of, every kind of different country you go to, you hear a slightly different story, all of which are plausible, but none of which are very easy to document. So the only way to tell that for sure, I guess, would be, well, you might be able to get some evidence for it genetically, but also looking at Golden Horde period sites and seeing if we start to see the first brown rats there, and preferably doing molecular IDs to make absolutely sure that they are brown rats. Yeah, it's entirely plausible. Although then it would raise the question of why do they not get further into Europe until later? So if they reach Eastern Europe with the Golden Horde, what is it that's stopping them from spreading into Western Europe until later? Or maybe they were in Western Europe earlier than we thought. Because again, a lot of archaeologists, especially if you don't have a skull, a lot of zooarchaeologists will kind of say if it's 17th or later, they'll say it's Rattus sp. We don't know which species it is. If it's earlier than that, people will often say Rattus rattus just because they think, you know, they read that brown rat arrived in the 18th century and this is the 14th century, so it can't be brown rat. So I think people aren't always, are sometimes a little bit steered by the conventional wisdom. So it's entirely plausible. So.
Can we have a continuation of this question? But if the brown rat is more adapted to the environment, if it came to Europe earlier, wouldn't it spread out? And
Yes.
So
yeah.
Even if you don't have skulls, I suppose it should be the evidence that.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. So what I'm saying here is I'm sceptical of some of the received wisdom, but there really isn't much in the way of hard evidence. And yeah, if brown rats reach parts of Europe fairly early, you would expect to find them spreading quite rapidly through Europe. So there is this question of why they didn't reach Europe earlier. If they did reach part of Europe earlier, why they didn't reach the rest of it. In fact, it's possible that even in the West we actually have earlier brown rats than we think we have, and we've just been overlooking them. Yeah, it would be very surprising if you had a barrier down the middle of Europe. You know, I wouldn't expect that to be the case. And I could also add that the question of brown rat actually becomes quite important for understanding plague again, because a lot of the observations that the Indian Plague Commission, for example, made in the 19th century are based on places where they had both black and brown rats at the same time. And so they observed the behaviour of black rats based on how black rats behave in settlements where they also have infestations of brown rats. So the idea that black rats you find mostly in the roof and that they don't burrow actually isn't true. Black rats do burrow, but they don't tend to come down to ground level so much if there are brown rats present. So actually, if you go back to 14th century Europe, where we assume there are not brown rats present, then it makes a big difference to how black rats would behave. So some of the people who are opposed to the idea of rats and plague argue that, well, because we don't have historical documents about black rats being seen dead, that implies they weren't present. Whereas in fact, if they were living in burrows more than in roofs, you wouldn't necessarily see if a lot of rats died off. So I think the question about when brown rats arrived and what black rat ecology was like in Europe before brown rats actually starts to be quite important for the plague question as well as for biogeography. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
I have a small question. Actually, you showed a lot of different points on your map, and it looks amazing. But you didn't mention, just maybe I missed it, how many points collecting sites have been studied yourself? Just because you mentioned about Northern Europe, so how many sites for these excavations, and what did you find? Skulls, bones, something like that. So it would be just value to input it in your presentation to show your personal input rather than just manipulative situation about all these points, which is actually like more interesting, like for journalists who can argue about it. But archaeologists should show just your evidences, just your collecting material.
Okay, relatively few points to my own, because again, I would argue it's not. Well, firstly, it would be bizarre not to look at the existing data that people have published over the years, simply because it's not my data. Now, of course, I can have a greater degree of confidence in things that I've seen myself, and where I've seen the archive and I understand the stratigraphy, rather than things that I've got second-hand. And I'm not entirely sure if I understand whether your criticism is of, you know, not differentiating. You know, I made a point of saying most of this is based on previous databases, based on previous work, and I've been going checking original sources and so on. In some cases, particularly in the north, checking original bones. Maybe we've submitted some for dating already, and there'll be more to come. The point of this project is not to study every assemblage in Europe. It's to take the data that already exists, because somebody has to, and it's 15 years since anybody last reviewed it, and then to try and go out and fill in the gaps in that data in order to tell a story. I would argue that that is an equally valuable contribution to going and studying 2 new sites in great detail that then will only tell you about those 2 sites and nothing else. So yeah, there's relatively little that has been, you know, bones that I have physically had in front of me on the table, and even of those, many of them had previously been recorded by somebody else, and I've been checking them. There are, as I said, with the Eastern Baltic, there are a few sites on there where I and the local archaeologist, or local zooarchaeologist, went and looked at, you know, a box of material which previously maybe had been sorted out as rodents. We have these rodents from the site, but nobody had studied in detail. And we've gone through and found, okay, actually we do have some rats here, but we don't. And the other point you could make is that what I haven't shown on the map are sites where we do not have rats present. Now that's obviously a problem because you need to decide what is a sufficiently intensively studied site. So one index you could use is are mice present, or you could use are microfauna present. And that's something we're going to be trying to do in this northern study, working with my colleagues in different countries to try and get as much of the data as we can together on sites where we don't have rats present as well, so we can have a bit more confidence in what it means when there is a blank on the map. The difficulty there is, depending on the country, it can be held very easy. So in England that will be extremely difficult because there are many sites and the data is very fragmented. In the Netherlands they have a central national database which doesn't have all the data but which has all the sites listed and a list of which species are present and the reference, so you can then go and check them more easily. So in the Netherlands I can very easily come up with a list of every site that has Apodemus clavicolis present at it and then go and check those reports. Okay, I can't check those reports easily because I don't have access to them, but my colleague in the Netherlands can go and check them. In Estonia I can do that as well. In France, yes. In Germany, no. In Norway, yes. In Sweden, no. And so there's kind of quite patchy situations with the data. But when it comes to showing the evidence, I would argue that it would be impossible for any single team of people to do a study on this scale using only things that they have done themselves. There has to be a degree of trusting what's out there in the literature, based on a critical reading, based on knowing what the methods and what the expertise was like at the time that those publications were written, and based on where the data seemed to be questionable, going in and doing targeted studies trying to check it. Does that answer your question at all?
Okay. As for zoologists, it's most interesting question how to differentiate both species. Is it quite easy question or just it's maybe difficult for archaeologists rather than zoologists?
Again, it depends who you ask. So based on the cranium, it's not a big problem at all. Based on the mandibles, it's not supposed to be a problem. However, there are cases where I've seen different people having a different opinion of it, which doesn't fill you with confidence. The big problem seems to be, so talking to my colleagues in Scandinavia, for example, one of the main sources is a German source for, you know, the relative osteological differences. And my Scandinavian colleagues tell me, well, we used to read that, we used to trust that source, but we've realized it doesn't work for Scandinavia. And so, again, when you're talking about 2 species, both of which adapt extremely fast, you know, they reach sexual maturity in less than a year, they have very short generation times, they have anything like 90 to 95% infant mortality, so there's extremely high selection, they will adapt fast. And in that case, you know, you wouldn't necessarily trust a morphological guide based on species in Spain to help you identify specimens in Finland, which is why I'm trying to use ZooMS, so collagen fingerprinting, as far as possible, which will give us a definitive answer for that. Skulls are another matter, but for postcranial bones. People used to use size quite a lot, but we already know that archaeological black rats are often a lot larger than modern black rats, and again that probably comes down to the effect of competition with brown rats. So you have some degree of niche partitioning that is resulting in black rats ending up being smaller. So there were some early finds which were identified as brown rat based on sheer size, which have since been reclassified as black rat when people realised that 1,000 years ago European black rat were somewhat larger than modern black rat. So there are lots of problems over time and over space in... Maybe I'm just too cautious, I don't know, maybe I'm over-skeptical, and maybe it's because I'm not a zoologist, I'm an archaeologist, but I'm a little bit cautious about definitive categorizations based on anything other than scope, without the aid of molecular methods.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your exciting talk.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.